The way it was done was this. The queen ordered him, Peter Pan, to kneel, and then said that for playing so beautifully, she would give him the wish of his heart. Then they all gathered round Peter to hear what was the wish of his heart, but for a long time he hesitated, not being certain what it was himself. "If I choose to go back to Mother," he asked at last, "could you give me that wish?" Now this question vexed the fairies, for were he to return to his mother they should lose his music. So the queen tilted her nose contemptuously and said, "Pooh, ask for a much bigger wish than that." "Is that quite a little wish?" he inquired. "As little as this," the queen answered, putting her hands very near to each other. "What size is a big wish?" Peter asked. She measured it off of her on her skirt, and it was a very handsome length. Then Peter reflected and said, "Well then, I think I shall have 2 little wishes instead of 1 big one." Of course, the fairies had to agree, though his cleverness rather shocked them, and he said that his first wish was to go to his mother, but with the right to return to the gardens if he found her disappointing. His second wish he reserved to hold. They tried to dissuade him and even put obstacles in the way. "I can give you the power to fly to her house," the queen said, "but I can't open the door for you." "The window I flew out at will be open," Peter said confidently. "Mother always keeps it open in the hope that I might fly back." "How do you know?" they asked, quite surprised, and really, Peter could not explain how he knew. "I just know it," he said. So as he persisted in his wish, they had to grant it. The way they gave him power to fly was this. They all tickled him on the shoulder, and soon he felt a funny itching in that part, and then up he rose, higher and higher, and flew away out of the gardens and over the housetops. It was so delicious that instead of flying straight to his own home, he skimmed away over St. Paul's to the Crystal Palace and back by the river and the Regent's Park, and by the time he reached his mother's window, he had quite made up his mind that his second wish should be to become a bird. The window was wide open, just as he knew it would be, and in he fluttered, and there was his mother lying asleep. Peter alighted softly on the wooden rail at the foot of the bed and had a good look at her. She lay with her head on her hand, and the hollow in the pillow was like a nest lined with her brown wavy hair. He remembered, though he had long forgotten it, that she always gave her hair a holiday at night. How sweet the frills of her nightgown were! He was very glad she was such a pretty mother. But she looked sad, and he knew why she looked sad. One of her arms moved as if it wanted to go round something, and he knew what it wanted to go around. "Oh, Mother," said Peter to himself, "if you just knew who is sitting on the rail at the foot of the bed." Very gently he patted the little mound that her feet made, and he could see by her face that she liked it. He knew he had but to say "Mother" ever so softly, and she would wake up. They always wake up at once if it is you that says their name. Then she would give such a joyous cry and squeeze him tight. How nice that would be to him, but oh, how it was exquisitely delicious it would be to her. That, I'm afraid, is how Peter regarded it. In returning to his mother, he never doubted that he was giving her the greatest treat a woman can have. Nothing can be more splendid, he thought, than to have a little boy of your own. How proud of him they are, and very right and proper too. But why does Peter sit so long on the rail? Why does he not tell his mother that he has come back? I quite shrink from the truth, which is that he sat there in two minds. Sometimes he looked longingly at his mother, and sometimes he looked longingly at the window. Certainly it would be pleasant to be her boy again, but on the other hand, what times those had been in the gardens! Was he so sure that he should enjoy wearing clothes again? He popped off the bed and opened some drawers to have a look at his old garments. They were still there, but he could not remember how he put them on. The socks, for instance, were they worn on the hands or on the feet? He was about to try one of them on his hand when he had a great adventure. Perhaps the drawer had creaked. At any rate, his mother woke up, for he heard her say, "Peter," as if it was the most lovely word in the language. He remained sitting on the floor and held his breath, wondering how she knew that he had come back. If she said Peter again, he meant to cry mother and run to her. But she spoke no more. She made little moans only, and when he next peeped at her, she was once more asleep, with tears on her face. It made Peter very miserable, and what do you think was the first thing he did? Sitting on the rail at the foot of the bed, he played a beautiful lullaby to his mother on his pipes. He made it up himself out of the way she said Peter, and he never stopped playing until she looked happy. He thought this so clever of him that he could scarcely resist waking her to hear her say, "Oh, Peter, how exquisitely you play." However, as she now seemed comfortable, he again cast looks at the window. You must not think that he meditated flying away and never coming back. He had quite decided to be his mother's boy, but hesitated about beginning tonight. It was the second wish which troubled him. He no longer meant to make it a wish to be a bird, but not to ask for a second wish seemed wasteful, and of course he could not ask for it without returning to the fairies. So, if he put off asking for his wish too long, it might go bad. He asked himself if he had not been hard-hearted to fly away without saying goodbye to Solomon. Hi, Disturbation. Thank you for joining us. I should like awfully to sail in my boat just once more, Peter said wistfully to his sleeping mother. He quite argued with her as if she could hear him. It would be so splendid to tell the birds of this adventure, he said coaxingly. I promised to come back, he said solemnly, and meant it too. And in the end, he flew away. Twice he came back from the window, wanting to kiss his mother, but he feared the delight of it might waken her. So at last he played her a lovely kiss on his pipe, and then he flew back to the gardens. Many nights and even months passed before he asked the fairies for his second wish, and I'm not sure that I quite know why he delayed so long. One reason was that he had so many goodbyes to say, not only to his particular friends, but to 100 favorite spots. But then he had his last sail, and his very last sail, and his last sail of all, and so on. Again, a number of farewell feasts were given in his honor, and another comfortable reason was that, after all, there was no hurry, for his mother would never weary of waiting for him. This last reason displeased old Solomon, for it was an encouragement to the birds to procrastinate. Solomon had several excellent mottos for keeping them at their work, such as, "Never put off laying today because you can lay tomorrow," and "In this world there are no second chances." And yet here was Peter gaily putting off none, and none the worse for it. The birds pointed this out to each other and fell into lazy habits. But mind you, though Peter was so slow in going back to his mother, he was quite decided to go back. The best proof of this was his caution with the fairies. They were most anxious that he should remain in the gardens to play to them, and to bring this to pass, they tried to trick him into making such a remark as, "I wish the grass was not so wet." Some of them danced out of time in the hope that he might cry, "I do wish you would keep time." Then they would have to say that this was his second wish. But he smoked their design. And though on occasion he began, "I wish," he would always stop just in time. So when at last he said to them bravely, "I wish now to go back to my mother forever and always," they had to tickle his shoulders and let him go. He went in a hurry in the end, because he had dreamt that his mother was crying, and he knew what that was the great thing she cried for, and that a hug from her splendid Peter would quickly make her to smile. Oh, he felt sure of it, and so eager was he to be nestling in her arms that this time he flew straight to the window, which was always to be open for him. But the window was closed, and there were iron bars on it. And peering inside, he saw his mother sleeping peacefully with her arm around another little boy. Peter called, "Mother, mother!" but she heard him not. In vain he beat his little limbs against the iron bars. He had to fly back sobbing to the gardens, and he never saw his dear again. What a glorious boy he had meant to be to her! Oh, Peter, we who have made the great mistake, how differently we should all act at the second chance. But Solomon was right. There is no second chance, not for most of us. When we reach the window, it is lockout time. The iron bars are up for life. Part 5. The Little House. Everybody has heard of the little house in the Kensington garden, which is the only house in the world that the fairies have built for humans. But no one has really seen it, except just 3 or 4. And they have not only seen it, but slept in it. And unless you sleep in it, you never see it. This is because it is not there when you lie down, but it is there when you wake up and step outside. In a kind of way, everyone may see it, but what you see is not really it, but only the light in the windows. You see the light after lockout time. David, for instance, saw it quite distinctly far away among the trees as we were going home from the pantomime, and Oliver Bailey saw it the night he stayed so late at the Temple, which is the name of his father's office. Angela Clare, who loves to have a tooth extracted, because then she is treated to tea in a shop, saw more than one light. She saw hundreds of them all together, and this must have been the fairies built in the house, for they built it every night and always in a different part of the gardens. She thought one of the lights was bigger than the others, though she was not quite sure, for they jumped about so, and it might have been another one that was bigger. But if it was the same one, it was Peter Pan's light. Heaps of children have seen the light, so that is nothing. But Mamie Mannering was the famous one for whom the house was first built. Hi, Amira. Mamie was always rather a strange girl, and it was at night that she was strange. She was 4 years of age, and in the daytime she was the ordinary kind. She was pleased when her brother Tony, who was a magnificent fellow of 6, took notice of her, and she looked up to him in the right way, and tried in vain to imitate him, and was flattered rather than annoyed when he shoved her about. Also, when she was batting, she would pause till the ball was in the air to point out to you that she was wearing new shoes. She was quite the ordinary kind in the daytime. But as the shades of night fell, Tony, the swaggerer, lost his contempt for Mamie and eyed her fearfully, and no wonder, for with dark there came into her face a look that I can describe only as a leery look. It was also a serene look that contrasted grandly with Tony's uneasy glances. Then he would make her presents of his favorite toys, which he always took away from her next morning, and she accepted them with a disturbing smile. I see. The reason he was now become so wheedling and she so mysterious was, in brief, that they knew they were about to be sent to bed. If you can hear that, I'm sorry. It was then that Mamie was terrible. Tony entreated her not to do it tonight, and the mother and their colored nurse threatened her, but Mamie merely smiled her agitating smile. And by, when they were alone with their night light, she would start up in bed, crying, "What's that?" Tony beseeches her. "It was nothing. Don't, Mamie, don't," and pulls the sheet over his head. "It's coming nearer," she cries. "Oh, look at it, Tony. It is feeling your bed with its horns. It is boring for you, oh, Tony. Oh," and she desists not until he rushes downstairs in combinations, screeching. When they came up to whip Mamie, they usually found her sleeping tranquilly. Not shamming, but really sleeping and looking like the sweetest little angel, which seems to me to make it almost worse. But of course, it was daytime when they were in the garden, and then Tony did most of the talking. You could gather from his talk that he was a very brave boy, and no one was so proud of it as Mamie. She would have loved to have a ticket on her saying that she was his sister. And at no time did she admire him more than when he told her, as he often did with splendid firmness, that one day he meant to remain behind in the gardens after the gates were closed. "Oh, Tony," she would say with awful respect, "but the fairies will be so angry." "I dare say," replied Tony carelessly. "Perhaps," she said, thrilling, "Peter Pan will give you a sail in his boat." "I shall make him," replied Tony. No wonder she was proud of him. But they should not have talked so loudly, for one day they were overheard by a fairy who had been gathering skeleton leaves from which the little people weave their summer curtains. And after that, Tony was a marked boy. They loosened the rails before he sat on them, so that down he came on his back of his head. They tripped him up by catching his bootlaces, and bribed the ducks to sink his boat. Nearly all the nasty accidents you meet with in the gardens occur because the fairies have taken an ill will to you, and so it behooves you to be careful what you say about them. Mamie was one of the kind who likes to fix a day for doing things, but Tony was not that kind, and when she asked him which day he was to remain behind in the gardens after lockout, he merely replied, just some day. He was quite vague about which day, except when she asked, will it be today? And then he could always say for certain that it would not be today. So she saw that he was waiting for a real good chance. This brings us to an afternoon when the gardens were white with snow, and there was ice on the round pond, not thick enough to skate on, but at least you could spoil it for tomorrow by flinging stones. And many bright little boys and girls were doing just that. When Tony and his sister arrived, they wanted to go straight to the pond, but their Aya said they must take a sharp walk first. And as she said this, she glanced at the time board to see when the gardens closed that night. It read 5:30. Poor Aya. She is the one who laughs continuously because there are so many white children in the world, but she was not to laugh much more that day. Well, they went up the baby walk and back, and when they returned to the time board, she was surprised to see that it now read 5 o'clock for closing time. But she was unacquainted with the tricky ways of the fairies, and so did not see, as Mamie and Tony saw at once, that they had changed the hour because there was to be a ball tonight. She said there was only time now to walk to the top of the hump and back, and as they trotted along with her, she little guessed what was thrilling their little breasts. You see, the chance had come of seeing a fairy ball. Never, Tony felt, could he hope for a better chance. He had to feel this for Mamie so plainly he felt it for himself. Her eager eyes asked the question, is it today? And he gasped and then nodded. Mamie slipped her hand into Tony's, and hers was hot, but his was cold. She did a very kind thing. She took off her scarf and gave it to him. In case you should feel cold, she whispered. Her face was aglow, but Tony's was very gloomy. As they turned on the top of the hump, he whispered to her, I'm afraid Nurse would see me, so I shan't be able to do it. Mamie admired him more than ever for being afraid of nothing but their Aya, when there were so many unknown terrors to fear, and she said aloud, Tony, I shall race you to the gate. And in a whisper, then you can hide. And off they ran. Tony could always outdistance her easily. Was it really 15 minutes? No, that was 3 minutes. Damn it. I pressed the wrong one. Tony could always outdistance her easily, but never had she known him speed away so quickly as now, and she was sure he hurried that he might have more time to hide. Brave, brave, her doting eyes were crying when she got a dreadful shock. Instead of hiding, her hero had run out at the gate. At this bitter sight, Mamie stopped blankly, as if all her lap full of darling treasures were suddenly spilled. And then, for very disdain, she could not stop sob. In a swell of protest against all bullying cowards, she ran to St. Govor's Well and hid in Tony's stead. When the Aya reached the gate and saw Tony far in front, she thought her other charge was with him and passed out. Twilight crept over the gardens, and hundreds of people passed out, including the last one, who always has to run for it. But Mamie saw them not. She had shut her eyes tight and glued them with passionate tears. When she opened them, something very cold ran up her legs and up her arms and dropped into her heart. It was the stillness of the gardens. Then she heard clang. Then from another part, clang. Then clang, clang, far away. It was the closing of the gates. Immediately, the last clang had died away. Mamie distinctly heard a voice say, "So that's all right." It had a wooden sound and seemed to come from above, and she looked up in time to see an elm tree stretching out and its arms, and stretching out its arms and yawning. She was about to say, "I never knew you could speak," when a metallic voice that seemed to come from the ladle at the well remarked to the elm, "I suppose it is a bit coldish up there." And the elm replied, "Not particularly, but you do get numb standing so long on one leg." And he flapped his arms vigorously, just as the cabmen do before they drive off. Mamie was quite surprised to see that a number of other tall trees were doing the same sort of thing, and she stole away to the baby walk and crouched observantly under a minorca holly, which shrugged its shoulders but did not seem to mind her. She was not in the least cold. She was wearing a russet-colored pelisse and had the hood over her head, so that nothing of her showed except her dear little face and her curls. The rest of her real self was hidden far away inside so many warm garments that in shape she seemed rather like a ball. She was about 40 round the waist. There was a good deal going on in the baby walk, where Mamie arrived in time to see a magnolia and a Persian lilac step over the railing and set off for a smart walk. They moved in a jerky sort of way, but that was because they used crutches, and Elderberry hobbled along across the walk, and there stood chatting with some young quinces, and they all had crutches. The crutches were the sticks that are tied to young trees and shrubs. They were quite familiar objects to Mamie, but she had never known what they were for until tonight. She peeped up the walk and saw her first fairy. He was a street boy fairy who was running up the walk closing the weeping trees. The way he did it was this. He pressed a spring in the trunks, and they shut up like umbrellas, deluging the little plants beneath the stone. "Oh, you naughty, naughty child!" Mamie cried indignantly, for she knew what it was to have a dripping umbrella about your ears. Fortunately, the mischievous fellow was out of earshot, but a chrysanthemum heard her and said so pointedly, "Hoity-toity, what is this?" that she had to come out and show herself. Then the whole vegetable kingdom was rather puzzled what to do. "Of course, it is no affair of ours," a spindle tree said, after they had whispered together. "But you know quite well you ought not to be here, and perhaps our duty is to report you to the fairies. What do you think yourself?" I think you should not, Amy replied, which so perplexed them that they said petulantly there was no arguing with her. I wouldn't ask it of you, she assured them, if I thought it was wrong. And of course, after this, they could not well carry tales. They then said, well a day, and such is life, for they can be frightfully sarcastic. But she felt sorry for them, those of them who had no grudges, and she said good-naturedly, before I go to the fairies' ball, I should like to take you for a walk one at a time. You can lean on me, you know. At this they clapped their hands, and she escorted them up the baby walk and back again, one at a time, putting an arm or a finger round the very frail, setting their leg right when it got too ridiculous, and treating the foreign ones quite courteously as the English, though she could not understand a word they said. They behaved well on the whole, though some whimpered. She had not taken them as far as she took Nancy or Grace or Dorothy, and others jabbed her, but it was quite unintentional, and she was too much of a lady to cry out. So much walking tired her, and she was anxious to be off to the ball, but she no longer felt afraid. The reason she felt no more fear was that it was now night time, and in the dark, you remember, Mamie was always so very strange. They were now loth to tell her, go, for if the fairies see you, they warned her, they will mischief you, stab you to death, or compel you to nurse their children, or turn you into something tedious like an evergreen oak. As they said this, they looked with affected pity at an evergreen oak, for in winter they are very envious of evergreens. Oh la! cried the oak bitingly. How deliciously cozy it is to stand here, buttoned to the neck, and watch you poor naked creatures shivering. This made them sulky, though they had really brought it on themselves, and they drew for Mamie a very gloomy picture of the perils that would face her if she insisted on going to the ball. She learned from a purple filbert that the court was not in its good temper at present, the cause being the tantalizing heart of the Duke of Christmas Daisies. He was an Oriental fairy, very poorly of a dreadful complaint, namely, inability to love, and though he had tried many ladies in many lands, he could not fall in love with one of them. Queen Mab, who rules in the gardens, had been confident that her girls would bewitch him. But alas, his heart, the doctor said, remained cold. This rather irritating doctor, who was his private physician, felt the Duke's heart immediately after any lady was presented, and then always shook his bald head and murmured, cold, quite cold. Naturally, Queen Mab felt disgraced, and first she tried the effect of ordering the court into tears for 9 minutes, and then she blamed the Cupids and decreed that they should wear fools' caps until they thawed the Duke's frozen heart. How I could, how I should love to see the Cupids in their dear little fools' caps, Mamie cried, and away she ran to look for them, very recklessly, for the Cupids hate to be laughed at. It is always easy to discover where a fairy's ball is being held, as ribbons are stretched between it and all the populous parts of the gardens, on which those invited may walk and stand without wetting their pumps. This night the ribbons were red and looked very pretty on the snow. Mamie walked alongside one of them for some distance, without meeting anybody, but at last she saw a fairy cavalcade approaching. To her surprise, they seemed to be returning from the ball, and she had just time to hide from them by bending her knees and holding out her arms and pretending to be a garden chair. There were 6 horsemen in front and 6 behind. In the middle walked a prim lady wearing a long train held up by 2 pages, and on the train, as if it were a couch, reclined a lovely girl, for in this way do aristocratic fairies travel about. She was dressed in golden rain, but the most enviable part of her was her neck, which was blue in color and of a velvet texture, and of course showed off her diamond necklace as no white throat could have glorified it. The high-born fairies obtain this admired effect by pricking their skins, which lets the blue blood come through and dye them, and you cannot imagine anything so dazzling unless you have seen the ladies' busts in the jewelers' windows. Mamie also noticed that the whole cavalcade seemed to be in a passion, tilting their noses higher than it can be safe for even fairies to tilt them, and she concluded that this must be another case in which the doctor had said, "Cold, quite cold." Well, she followed the ribbon to a place where it became a bridge over a dry puddle into which another fairy had fallen and been unable to climb out. At first, this little damsel was afraid of Mamie, who most kindly went to her aid. But soon she sat in her hand, chatting gaily and explaining that her name was Brownie, and that though only a poor street singer, she was on her way to the ball to see if the Duke would have her. "Of course," she said, "I am rather plain." And this made Mamie uncomfortable, for indeed the simple little creature was almost quite plain for a fairy. It was difficult to know what to reply. "I see you think I have no chance," Brownie said, falteringly. "I don't say that," Mamie answered politely. "Of course, your face is just a tiny bit homely, but really it was quite awkward for her." Fortunately, she remembered her father and the bazaar. He had gone to a fashionable bazaar where all the most beautiful ladies in London were on view for half a crown the second day. But on his return home, instead of being dissatisfied with Mamie's mother, he had said, "You can't think, my dear, what a relief it is to see a homely face again." Mamie repeated this story, and it fortified Brownie tremendously. Indeed, she had no longer the slightest doubt that the Duke would choose her. So she scudded away up the ribbon, calling out to Mamie not to follow, lest the Queen should mischief her. But Mamie's curiosity tugged her forward, and presently, at the 7 Spanish chestnuts, she saw a wonderful light. She crept forward until she was quite near, and then she peeped from behind a tree. The light, which was as high above your head as the ground is below, was composed of myriads of glow-worms, all holding on to each other, and so forming a dazzling canopy over the fairy ring. There were thousands of little people looking on, but they were in shadow and drab in color compared to the glorious creatures within that luminous circle, who were so bewilderingly bright that Mamie had to wink hard all the time that she looked at them. It was amazing and even irritating to her that the Duke of Christmas Daisies should be able to keep out of love for a moment, yet out of love his dusky grace still was. You could see it by the shamed looks of the Queen and court, though they pretended not to care. By the way, darling ladies brought forward for his approval burst into tears as they were told to pass on, and by his own most weary face. Mamie could also see the pompous doctor feeling the Duke's heart and hearing him give utterances to his parrot cry, and she was particularly sorry for the Cupids, who stood in their foolscaps in obscure places, and every time they heard that cold, quite cold, bowed their disgraced little heads. She was disappointed not to see Peter Pan, and I may as well tell you now why he was so late that night. It was because his boat had got wedged on the Serpentine between fields of floating ice, through which he had to break a perilous passage with his trusty paddle. The fairies had as yet scarcely missed him, for they could not dance, so heavy were their hearts. They forget all the steps when they are sad, and remember them again when they are merry. David tells me that fairies never say, "We feel happy." What they say is, "We feel dancy." Well, they were looking very undancy indeed, when sudden laughter broke out among the onlookers, caused by Brownie, who had just arrived and was insisting on her right to be presented to the Duke. Mamie craned forward eagerly to see how her friend fared, though she had really no hope. No one seemed to have the least hope except Brownie herself, who, however, was absolutely confident. She was led before his grace, and the doctor put in a finger carelessly on the ducal heart, which for convenience sake was reached by a little trapdoor in his diamond shirt, begun to say mechanically, "Cold, what?" when he abruptly stopped. "What's this?" he cried, and first he shook the heart like a watch, and then he put his ear to it. "Bless my soul!" cried the doctor, and by this time, of course, the excitement among the spectators was tremendous, fairies fainting right and left. Everybody stared breathlessly at the Duke, who was very much startled and looked as if he would like to run away. "Good gracious me!" the doctor was heard muttering, and now the heart was evidently on fire, for he had to jerk his fingers away from it and put them in his mouth. The suspense was awful. Then in a loud voice, and bowing low, "My Lord Duke," said the physician elatedly, "I have the honor to inform your Excellency that your Grace is in love. You can't conceive the effect of it." Brownie held out her arms to the Duke, and he flung himself into them. The Queen leapt into the arms of Lord Chamberlain, and the ladies of the court leapt into the arms of her gentlemen, for it is etiquette to follow her example in everything. Thus, in a single moment, about 50 marriages took place, for if you leap into each other's arms, it is a fairy wedding. Of course, a clergyman has to be present. How the crowd cheered and leapt! Trumpets brayed, the moon came out, and immediately 1,000 couples seized hold of its rays as if they were ribbons in a May dance, and waltzed in wild abandon round the fairy ring. Most gladsome sight of all, the Cupids plucked the hated fools' caps from their heads and cast them high in the air. And then Mamie went and spoiled everything. She couldn't help it. She was crazy with delight over her little friend's good fortune. So she took several steps forward and cried in ecstasy, "Oh, Brownie, how splendid!" Everybody stood still. The music ceased. The lights went out. And all in the time you may take to say, "Oh dear." an awful sense of peril came upon Mamie. Too late she remembered that she was a lost child in a place where no human must be between locking and the opening of the gates. She heard the murmur of an angry multitude. She saw 1,000 swords flashing for her blood, and she uttered a cry of terror and fled. How she ran! And all the time her eyes were starting out of her head. Many times she lay down and then quickly jumped up and ran on again. Her little mind was so entangled in terrors that she no longer knew she was in the gardens. The one thing she was sure of was that she must never cease to run, and she thought she was still running long after she had dropped in the fix and gone to sleep. She thought the snowflakes falling on her face were her mother kissing her good night. She thought her coverlet of snow was a warm blanket and tried to pull it over her head. And when she heard talking through her dreams, she thought it was Mother bringing Father to the nursery door to look as she slept. But it was the fairies. I am very glad to be able to say that they no longer desired to mischief her. When she rushed away, they had rent the air with such cries as "Slay her!" "Turn her into something extremely unpleasant!" and so on. But the pursuit was delayed while they discussed who should march in front, and this gave Duchess Brownie time to cast herself before the Queen and demand a boon. Every bride has a right to a boon, and what she asked for was Mamie's life. "Anything except that," replied Queen Mab sternly, and all the fairies echoed, "Anything except that." But when they learned how Mamie had befriended Brownie and so enabled her to attend the ball to their great glory and renown, they gave 3 huzzas for the little human and set off like an army to thank her, the court advancing in front and the canopy keeping step with it. They traced Mamie easily by her footprints in the snow, but though they found her deep in snow in the fix, it seemed impossible to thank Mamie, for they could not waken her. They went through the form of thanking her, that is to say, the new king stood on her body and read her a long address of welcome, but she heard not a word of it. They also cleared the snow off of her, but soon she was covered again, and they saw she was in danger of perishing of cold. "Turn her into something that does not mind the cold," seemed a good suggestion of the doctor's, but the only thing they could think of was that does not mind a cold was a snowflake, and it might melt, the Queen pointed out, so that idea had to be given up. A magnificent attempt was made to carry her to a sheltered spot, but though there were so many of them, she was too heavy. By this time, all the ladies were crying in their handkerchiefs, but presently the Cupids had a lovely idea. "Build a house around her," they cried, and at once everybody perceived that this was the thing to do. In a moment 100 fairy sawyers were among the branches, architecting where, running around Mamie, measuring her. A bricklayer's yard sprang up at her feet. 75 masons rushed up with the foundation stone, and the Queen laid it. Overseers were appointed to keep the boys off. Scaffolding were run up. The whole place rang with hammers and chisels and turning lathes, and by the time the roof was on and the glazers were putting in the windows, the house was exactly the size of Mamie and perfectly lovely. One of her arms was extended, and this had bothered them for a second, but they built a veranda around it, leading to the front door. Sorry, one second. The windows were the size of a colored picture book, and the door rather smaller, but it would be easy for her to get out by taking off the roof. The fairies, as is their custom, clapped their hands with delight over their cleverness, and they were so madly in love with the little house that they could not bear to think they had finished it. So they gave it ever so many little extra touches, and even then they added more extra touches. For instance, two of them ran up a ladder and put on a chimney. Now we fear it is quite finished, they sighed. But no, for another two ran up the ladder and tied some smoke to the chimney. That certainly finishes it, they said reluctantly. Not at all, cried a glowworm. If she were to wake without seeing a nightlight, she might be frightened, so I shall be her nightlight. Wait one moment, said a china merchant, and I shall make you a saucer. Now, alas, it was absolutely finished. Oh dear, no. Gracious me, cried a brass manufacturer, there is no handle on the door. And so he put one on. An ironmonger added a scraper, and an old lady ran up with a doormat. Carpenters arrived with a water butt, and the painters insisted on painting it. Finished at last. Finished? How can it be finished? The plumber demanded scornfully. Before hot and cold water are put in. And he put in hot and cold water. Then an army of gardeners arrived with fairy carts and spades, and seeds and bulbs and porcelain houses, and soon they had a flower garden to the right of the veranda, and a vegetable garden to the left, and roses and clematis on the walls of the house. And in less time than 5 minutes, all these dear things were in full bloom. Oh, how beautiful the little house was! But it was at last finished true as true, and they had to leave it and return to the dance. They all kissed their hands to it as they went away, and the last to go was Brownie. She stayed a moment behind the others to drop a pleasant dream down the chimney. All through the night the exquisite little house stood there in the fix, taking care of Mamie, and she never knew. She slept until the dream was quite finished, and woke feeling deliciously cozy, just as morning was breaking from its egg. And then she almost fell asleep again, and then she called out, Tony, for she thought she was at home in the nursery. As Tony made no answer, she sat up, whereupon her head hit the roof, and it opened like the lid of a box, and to her bewilderment she saw all around her the Kensington gardens lying deep in snow. As she was not in the nursery, she wondered whether this was really herself, though she pinched her own cheeks. But then she knew it was herself, and this reminded her that she was in the middle of a great adventure. She remembered how everything that had happened to her from the closing of the gates up to her running away from the fairies. But however, she asked herself, had she got into this funny place? She stepped out by the roof, right over the garden, and then she saw the dear house in which she had passed the night. It so entranced her that she could think of nothing else. Oh, you darling! Oh, you sweet! Oh, you darling love! She cried. Perhaps a human voice frightened the little house, or maybe it now knew that its work was done, for no sooner had Mamie spoken than it began to grow smaller and smaller, and it shrank so slowly that she could scarce believe it was shrinking, yet she soon knew that it could not contain her now. It always remained as complete as ever, but it became smaller and smaller, and the garden dwindled at the same time, and the snow crept closer, lapping house and garden clean up. Now, the house was the size of a little dog's kennel, and now of a Noah's Ark, but still you could see the smoke and the door handle and the roses on the wall, every one complete. The glow-worm light was waning too, but it was still there. "Darling, loveliest, don't go," Mamie cried, falling on her knees, for the little house was now the size of a reel of thread, but still quite complete. But as she stretched out her arms imploringly, the snow crept up on all sides until it met itself, and where the little house had been was now one unbroken expanse of snow. Mamie stamped her foot naughtily and was putting her fingers to her eyes when she heard a kind voice say, "Don't cry, pretty human, don't cry." And then she turned round and saw a beautiful little naked boy regarding her wistfully. She knew at once that this must be Peter Pan. Part 6. Peter's Goat. Mamie felt quite shy, but Peter knew not what shy was. "I hope you have a good night," he said earnestly. "Thank you," she replied. "I was so cozy and warm, but you," and she looked at his nakedness awkwardly, "don't you feel the least bit cold?" Now cold was another word Peter had forgotten, so he answered, "I think not, but I may be wrong. You see, I am rather ignorant. I am not exactly a boy. Solomon says I am a betwixt and between." "So that is what that is called," said Mamie thoughtfully. "That's not my name," he explained. "My name is Peter Pan." "Yes, of course," she said. "I know. Everybody knows." Can't think how pleased Peter was to learn that all the people outside the gates knew about him. He begged Mamie to tell him what they knew and what they said, and she did so. They were sitting by this time on a fallen tree. Peter had cleared off the snow for Mamie, but he sat on the snowy bit himself. "Squeeze closer," Mamie said. "What is that?" he asked, and she showed him, and then he did so. They talked together, and he found that people knew a great deal about him, but not everything. Not that he had gone back to his mother and been barred out, for instance. And he said nothing of this to Mamie, for it still humiliated him. "Do they know that I play games exactly like real boys?" he asked very proudly. "Oh, Mamie, please tell them." But when he revealed how he played, by sailing his hoop on the round pond and so on, she was simply horrified. "All of your ways of playing," she said with her big eyes on him, "are quite wrong, not in the least like how boys play." Poor Peter uttered a little moan at this, and he cried for the first time for I know not how long. Mamie was extremely sorry for him and lent him her handkerchief, but he didn't know in the least what to do with it, so she showed him, that is to say, she wiped her eyes, and then gave it back to him and said, "Now you do it." But instead of wiping his own eyes, he wiped hers, and she thought it best to pretend that this was what she had meant. She said out of pity for him, "I shall give you a kiss if you like." But though he once knew, he had long forgotten what kisses are, and he replied, "Thank you," and held out his hand, thinking she had offered to put something into it. This was a great shock to her, but she felt she could not explain without shaming him. So with charming delicacy, she gave Peter a thimble which happened to be in her pocket, and pretended that it was a kiss. Poor little boy, he quite believed her, and to this day he wears it on his finger, though there can be scarcely anyone who needs a thimble so little. You see, though still a tiny child, it was really years and years since he had seen his mother, and I dare say the baby who had supplanted him was now a man with whiskers. But you must not think that Peter Pan was a boy to pity rather than to admire. If Mamie began by thinking this, she soon found she was very much mistaken. Her eyes glistened with admiration when he told her of his adventures, especially of how he went to and fro between the island and the gardens and the thrush's nest. "Oh, how romantic!" Mamie exclaimed. But this was another unknown word, and he hung his head thinking she was despising him. "I suppose Tony would not have done that," he said very humbly. "Never, never," she answered with conviction. "He would have been afraid." "What is afraid?" asked Peter longingly. He thought it must be some splendid thing. "I do wish you would teach me how to be afraid, Mamie," he said. "I believe no one could teach that to you," she answered adoringly. But Peter thought she meant that he was stupid. She had told him about Tony, and of the wicked things he did in the dark to frighten him. She did in the dark to frighten him. She knew quite well that it was wicked. But Peter misunderstood her meaning and said, "Oh, I wish I was as brave as Tony." It quite irritated her. "You are 20,000 times braver than Tony," she said. "You are ever so much the bravest boy I have ever known." He could scarcely believe she meant it, but when he did believe, he screamed with joy. "And if you want very much to give me a kiss," Mamie said, "you can do it." Very reluctantly, Peter began to take the thimble off his finger. He thought she wanted it back. "Oh, I don't mean a kiss," she said hurriedly. I meant a thimble." "What is a thimble?" Peter asked. "It is like this," she said, and then she kissed him. "I should love to give you a thimble," Peter said gravely, so he gave her one. He gave her quite a number of thimbles, and then a delightful idea came into his head. "Mamie," he said, "will you marry me?" Now, strange to tell, the same idea had come at exactly the same time into Mamie's head. "I should like to," she said, "but will there be room in your boat for two of us?" "If you squeeze close," he said eagerly. "But perhaps the birds would be angry." He assured her that the birds would love to have her, though I am not so certain of it myself, although there were few birds in the winter. "Of course, they might want your clothes," he had to admit rather falteringly. She was somewhat indignant at this. "They are always thinking of their nests," he said apologetically, "and there are some bits of you," he stroked the fur of her pelisse, "that would excite them very much." "Oh, they shan't have my furs," she said sharply. "No," he said, still fondling it, however. "No. Oh, Mamie," he said rapturously, "do you know why I love you? It is because you are like a beautiful nest." Somehow this made her uneasy. "I think you are speaking more like a bird than a boy now," she said, holding back. Indeed, he was even looking rather like a bird. "After all," she said, "you are only a betwixt and in between." But it hurt him so much that she immediately added, "It must be a delicious thing to be." "Come and be one then, dear Mamie," he implored her, and they set off for the boat, for it was now very near open gate time. "And you are not a bit like a nest," he whispered to please her. "But I think it is rather nice to be like one," she said in a woman's contradictory way. "And Peter dear, though I can't give them my furs, I wouldn't mind their building in it. Fancy a nest in my neck with little spotty eggs in it. Oh, Peter, how perfectly lovely." But as they drew near the Serpentine, She shivered a little and said, "Of course I shall go and see Mother often, quite often. It is not as if I was saying good-bye forever to Mother. It is not in the least like that." "Oh, no," answered Peter, but in his heart he knew it was very like that, and he would have told her so had he not been in a quaking fear of losing her. He was so fond of her. He felt he could not live without her. "She will forget her mother in time and be happy with me," he kept saying to himself, and he hurried her on, giving her thimbles all the way. But even when she had seen the boat and exclaimed ecstatically over its loveliness, she still talked tremblingly about her mother. "You know quite well, Peter, don't you," she said, "that I wouldn't come unless I knew for certain I could go back to Mother whenever I wanted to. Peter, please say it." He said it, but he could no longer look her in the face. "Are you sure your mother will always want you?" he added rather sourly. "The idea of Mother not always wanting me!" Amy cried, and her face glistened with tears. "If she doesn't bar you out," Peter said huskily. "The door," replied Mamie, "will always, always be open, and Mother will always be waiting at it for me." "Then," Peter said, not without grimness, "step in if you feel so sure of her." And he helped Mamie into the thrush's nest. "But why don't you look at me?" she asked, taking him by the arm. Peter tried hard not to look. He tried to push off. Then he gave a great gulp and jumped ashore and sat down miserably in the snow. She went to him. "What is it, dear Peter?" she said, wondering. "Oh, Mamie," he cried, "it isn't fair to take you with me if you think you can go back. Your mother," he gulped again, "you don't know them as well as I do." And then he told her the woeful story of how he had been barred out, and she gasped all the time. "But my mother," she said, "my mother—" "Yes, she would," said Peter. "They are all the same. I dare say she is looking for another one already." Mamie said aghast, "I can't believe it. You see, when you went away, your mother had none, but my mother has Tony, and surely they are satisfied when they have one." Peter replied bitterly, "You should see the letters Solomon gets from ladies who have six." Just then they heard a grating creak, followed by creak, creak, all around the gardens. It was the opening of the gates, and Peter jumped nervously into his boat. He knew now Mamie would not come with him, and he was trying bravely not to cry. But Mamie was sobbing painfully. "If I should be too late," she said in agony. "Oh, Peter, if she has gotten another one already!" Again he sprang ashore as if she had called him back. "I shall come and look for you tonight," he said, squeezing close. "But if you hurry away, I think you will be there in time." Then he pressed a last thimble on her sweet little mouth and covered his face with his hands so that he might not see her go. "Dear Peter," she cried. "Dear Mamie," cried the tragic boy. She leapt into his arms so that it was a sort of fairy wedding, and then she hurried away. Oh, how she hastened to the gates! Peter, you may be sure, was back in the gardens that night as soon as lockout sounded, but he found no Mamie, and so he knew she had been in time, for long he had hoped that some night she would come back for him. Often he thought he saw her waiting for him by the shore of the Serpentine as his bark drew to land, but Mamie never went back. Amy wanted to, but she was afraid that if she saw her dear betwixt and between again, she would linger with him too long. Besides, the aunt now kept a sharp eye on her, but she often talked lovingly of Peter, and she knitted a kettle holder for him. And one day, when she was wondering what Easter present he would like, her mother made a suggestion. Nothing, she said thoughtfully, would be so useful to him as a goat. He could ride on it, cried Mamie, and play on his pipes at the same time. Then her mother asked, won't you give him your goat, the one you frightened Tony with that night? But that isn't a real goat, Mamie said. It seems very real to Tony, replied her mother. It seems frightfully real to me too, Mamie admitted. But how can I give it to Peter? Her mother knew a way, and next day, accompanied by Tony, who was really quite a nice boy, though of course he could not compare, they went to the gardens, and Mamie stood alone within a fairy ring, and then her mother, who was a rather gifted lady, said, my daughter, tell me, if you can, what have you got for Peter Pan? To which Mamie replied, I have a goat for him to ride. Observe me cast it far and wide. She then flung her arms about as if she were sowing seeds, and turned around 3 times. Next Tony said, if Pete doth find it waiting here, wilt ne'er again make me to fear. And Mamie answered, by dark or light I fondly swear never to see goats anywhere. She also left a letter to Peter in a likely place, explaining what she had done, and begging him to ask the fairies to turn the goat into one convenient for riding. Well, it all happened just as she hoped, for Peter found the letter, and of course nothing could be easier for the fairies than to turn the goat into a real one, and so that is how Peter got the goat, on which he now rides around the gardens every night, playing sublimely on his pipes. And Mamie kept her promise, and never frightened Tony with a goat again, though I have heard that she created another animal. Until she was quite a big girl, she continued to leave presents for Peter in the garden, with letters explaining how humans play with them. She is not the only one who has done this. David does it, for instance, and he and I know the likeliest place for leaving them in, and we shall tell you if you like, but for mercy's sake don't ask us before Porthos, for he is so fond of toys that were he to find out this place, he would take every one of them. As you may remember, Porthos is their dog. Though Peter still remembers Mamie, he is ever as happy as ever, and often in sheer glee jumps off his goat and lies kicking merrily in the grass. Oh, he has a joyful time, but he has still a vague memory that he was once a human, and it makes him especially kind to the house swallows when they visit the island, for house swallows are the spirits of little children who have passed. They always build their eaves in the eaves of the houses where they lived when they were human, and sometimes they try to fly in at a nursery window, and perhaps that is why Peter loves them best of all the birds. And the little house, every lawful night, that is to say, every night except fall nights, the fairies now build the little house, lest there should be a human child lost in the gardens, and Peter rides the marches, looking for lost ones, and if he finds them, he carries them on his goat to the little house, and when they wake up, they are in it, and when they step out they see it. The fairies build the house merely because it is so pretty, but Peter rides round in the memory of Mamie, and because he still loves to do just as he believes real boys would do. But you must not think that because somewhere among the trees the little house is twinkling, it is a safe thing to remain in the gardens after lockout time. If the bad ones among the fairies happen to be out that night, they will certainly mischief you, and even though they are not, you may perish of cold and dark before Peter Pan comes around. He has been too late several times, and when he sees he is too late, he runs back to the thrush's nest for his paddle, of which Mamie has told him the true use, and he digs a little grave for the child and erects a little tombstone and carves the poor thing's initials onto it. He does this at once because he thinks it is what real boys would do, and you must have noticed the little stones, and that there are always two together. He puts them in twos because they seem less lonely. I think that is quite the most touching sight in the gardens, when there are two tombstones of Walter Stevens Matthews and Phoebe Phelps. They stand together at the spot where the parish of Westminster St. Mary's is said to meet the parish of Paddington. Here Peter found the two babes who had fallen unnoticed from their prams, Phoebe aged 13 months, and Walter probably still younger, for Peter seemed to have felt a delicacy about putting any age on the stone. They lie side by side, and the simple inscription reads, Grave Instructions. David sometimes places white flowers on these two innocent graves. And that is the end of Peter Pan in Kensington Garden